Germanicus Julius Caesar was everything Rome wanted in a leader. At 33 years old, he had conquered Germanic tribes that had humiliated Roman legions for decades. Soldiers would die for him. Common people lined streets just to catch a glimpse of him. Women threw flowers at his feet. He was handsome, charismatic, brilliant in battle, and merciful in victory. He had the blood of Augustus Caesar flowing through his veins and a beautiful wife, Agrippina the Elder, who had given him 9 children. He was Rome's golden future. Emperor Tiberius hated him for it. Tiberius was Germanicus's uncle, a bitter man who never wanted to be emperor. Augustus had forced the role on him after other heirs died. Tiberius knew the Senate preferred Germanicus. He knew the people loved Germanicus. He knew his own reign was just a placeholder until the Golden Prince could take over. That knowledge ate at him like poison every single day. In 19 AD, Tiberius sent Germanicus to Syria on a diplomatic mission. It seemed like an honor, an important assignment in the eastern provinces. Germanicus went willingly, taking Agrippina and their younger children with him. He didn't realize he was walking into a trap. The governor of Syria was a man named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, a known loyalist of Tiberius. From the moment Germanicus arrived, Piso undermined every order, contradicted every decision, and publicly insulted Rome's most beloved general. Germanicus tried to maintain dignity, to work around the obstruction, but Piso made governance impossible. Then Germanicus got sick. It started with stomach pains, violent enough to double him over during meetings. Then came the vomiting, so severe that he couldn't keep down water. His hair began falling out in clumps. His fingernails turned black and dropped off. The pain became so intense that servants could hear him screaming from outside the palace walls. This wasn't normal illness. Everyone knew it, but no one could stop it. Agrippina watched her husband deteriorate over weeks. She held him as he convulsed. She wiped blood from his lips. She saw the terror in his eyes as he realized what was happening. Germanicus knew he was being murdered, and he knew who was responsible. As Germanicus lay dying, servants made a horrific discovery. Under the floorboards of his bedroom, they found curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with death spells. Buried in the walls were decaying animal parts arranged in ritual patterns. Human bones had been hidden under his bed. Someone had filled the house with black magic designed to kill him slowly and painfully. Germanicus dictated his will from his deathbed, his voice barely a whisper. He accused Piso directly, begged Agrippina to seek justice, and made his eldest sons promise to avenge him. On October 10, 19 AD, surrounded by his weeping family, Germanicus died in agony at 33 years old. The autopsy revealed clear signs of poisoning in his organs. News of his death reached Rome weeks later. The city went into spontaneous mourning. People tore their clothes. Shops closed. Riots nearly broke out. When Agrippina arrived carrying her husband's ashes in an urn, hundreds of thousands lined the streets weeping. It was the largest public funeral Rome had ever seen. Tiberius barely acknowledged it. He stayed in his palace, refused to attend any ceremonies, and issued only a brief, cold statement. His absence spoke volumes. The Senate demanded an investigation. They wanted Piso prosecuted for murder. The trial became a political circus. Piso defended himself by saying he only followed orders, implying Tiberius had authorized everything. Before he could testify further, Piso was found dead in his bedroom, throat cut, in what officials quickly ruled a suicide. Convenient. Too convenient. No one was ever truly held accountable for Germanicus's murder. The investigation died with Piso. Tiberius made vague statements about justice being served and moved on. But Agrippina knew the truth. Her husband had been assassinated on imperial orders, murdered slowly with poison and curses because Tiberius feared his popularity. She now had 9 children, 6 of them still young, all of them orphaned by their own family, and they were now under the protection of the man who had killed their father. Agrippina looked at her children and made a silent vow. She would make Tiberius pay. She would see justice for Germanicus, even if it took the rest of her life. she would fight for her sons' right to inherit what their father had been denied. What she didn't understand yet was that Tiberius wasn't just ruthless, he was patient. And he was already planning how to destroy Germanicus's entire bloodline, one child at a time. The trap had closed around her family, and the only question was how many of them would survive what came next. After Germanicus's death, something broke inside Tiberius. The guilt, or maybe just the paranoia of having committed murder, transformed him from a reluctant emperor into a monster. He stopped pretending to care about Rome's opinion. He stopped pretending to be a decent human being. In 26 AD, 7 years after Germanicus died, Tiberius did something unprecedented. He abandoned Rome entirely. He left the capital, moved to the island of Capri, and never returned for the remaining 11 years of his life. An emperor fleeing his own empire. It should have caused chaos, but Tiberius ruled through letters and proxies, maintaining iron control from his island fortress. Capri became his prison and his playground. He built 12 villas across the island, but Villa Jovis was his masterpiece of depravity. Perched on a cliff 300 meters above the sea, it was designed for 3 things: luxury, surveillance, and murder. The palace had secret passages throughout, allowing Tiberius to spy on guests and servants. He installed peepholes in bedroom walls. He had rooms specially designed for torture, soundproofed so screams wouldn't disturb his dinner parties. And that cliff, that beautiful, deadly cliff, served a specific purpose. When Tiberius grew tired of someone, or suspected disloyalty, or simply felt like it, he would have them thrown from the cliff. But he refined the process. At the bottom, stationed on the rocks, were soldiers with clubs and spears. Their job was to finish off anyone who survived the fall. Tiberius would watch from above with wine in hand, making sure no one lived to tell stories. The sexual depravity became legendary, though historians struggled to write about it explicitly. Suetonius, the Roman historian, documented practices so disturbing that he wrote them in Greek instead of Latin, assuming fewer people would be able to read the details. Tiberius had trained young children, boys and girls, called his little fishes, to swim between his legs in the palace pools and perform sexual acts underwater. He collected pornographic paintings and sculptures, creating what he called his instruction library. But the physical perversions were only part of his descent. The paranoia consumed everything else. Tiberius created a network of informants throughout Rome and the provinces. Anyone could anonymously accuse anyone of treason. There was no due process, no real investigation. If someone was accused, they were usually executed. Better safe than sorry became imperial policy. Back in Rome, Agrippina was fighting for her sons' futures. She openly criticized Tiberius, gathered support among senators, and demanded recognition of her children's rights as Germanicus's heirs. She was brave, fierce, and completely unaware of how thoroughly Tiberius had planned her destruction. Tiberius had installed a man named Sejanus as his deputy, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was ambitious, ruthless, and had Tiberius's complete trust. Together, they began systematically eliminating Germanicus's children. It started with arrests. In 29 AD, Agrippina and her 2 eldest sons, Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar, were arrested on fabricated treason charges. The accusations were absurd, claiming they plotted to overthrow Tiberius. The evidence was manufactured. The trials were shams. But it didn't matter. Tiberius wanted them gone. Agrippina was exiled to the island of Pandatereia, the same island where Augustus had once exiled his own daughter. It was essentially a rock in the Mediterranean, barren and isolated. Agrippina was imprisoned in a small cell, guarded by soldiers who had orders to make her life miser. They beat her regularly. During one beating, a centurion struck her face so hard that her left eye was permanently damaged. She lost vision in that eye, a visible reminder of imperial brutality. They restricted her food, giving her barely enough to survive. Agrippina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, wife of the empire's greatest general, was being slowly tortured to death. Her sons had it worse. Nero Caesar, the eldest, was imprisoned on a different island. Guards tormented him psychologically, telling him daily that his mother and brothers were dead, that he was forgotten, that no one was coming to save him. They restricted his food to starvation levels. Historical records indicate that toward the end, he became so desperate that he tried to eat the stuffing from his mattress. He died of starvation in 31 AD. Drusus Caesar was imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the imperial palace in Rome itself. He was kept in complete darkness, given minimal food and water. The isolation drove him insane. Guards documented him talking to himself, screaming at hallucinations, begging invisible people for mercy. When he finally realized no rescue was coming, he too tried to eat anything available, including pieces of his mattress. He died in 33 AD, having not seen sunlight for years. Agrippina heard about her son's deaths while still imprisoned. The news broke something fundamental in her. She stopped eating voluntarily, choosing starvation as a final act of defiance. She refused every meal, determined to die on her own terms, rather than give Tiberius the satisfaction of watching her suffer indefinitely. She died in 33 AD, blind in one eye, broken in body, but still defiant to the end. 3 of Germanicus's 9 children were now dead. 3 more daughters had been married off to loyal imperial families, effectively neutralized as political threats. That left 3 children, Drusilla, Livilla, and young Gaius, who everyone called by his childhood nickname, Caligula, which meant little boot. Caligula was 21 years old when his mother died. He had watched his father be poisoned. He had seen his mother and brothers arrested and executed. He understood perfectly what happened to people who opposed Tiberius, and that understanding would shape everything he became. Because Tiberius wasn't done with Germanicus's bloodline. He had one final torture planned. He was bringing young Caligula to live with him on Capri, to keep him close, to train him personally. The boy would learn exactly how power really worked in Rome. And that education would create something far worse than Tiberius could ever imagine. When Caligula arrived on Capri in 31 AD, he was 20 years old and terrified. He had just watched his entire family be systematically destroyed. His father poisoned, his mother beaten and starved, his brothers tortured to death in dungeons. He was the last surviving son of Germanicus, and he was being summoned to live with the man who had orchestrated it all. The boat ride to Capri must have felt like sailing to his own execution. Caligula knew what happened on that island. Everyone knew. The rumors coming from Capri were so disturbing that senators whispered about them in private, never daring to speak openly. Torture chambers, sexual depravity beyond description, people thrown from cliffs for entertainment. And now Caligula was going to live there, trapped with a paranoid emperor who had already murdered most of his family. Tiberius was 72 years old by then, his face scarred by a chronic skin disease that left his features covered in lesions and scabs. He wore makeup to cover the worst of it, but up close, the damage was visible. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp and cruel. He looked at Caligula and saw both a potential threat and an opportunity. The young man was the last male heir of Germanicus. Killing him would be politically difficult. The Roman people still loved Germanicus's memory, and executing his last surviving son might trigger actual rebellion. But keeping him alive and broken, keeping him obedient and terrified, that could be useful. A controllable heir was better than a rebellious one. So Tiberius began Caligula's education in survival through psychological torture. He made the young man attend executions, forced him to watch as suspected traitors were interrogated under torture. Caligula had to stand there, expression neutral, as people screamed and begged for mercy. Any sign of sympathy, any visible emotion, could be interpreted as disloyalty to the emperor. The sexual depravity was impossible to avoid. Villa Jovis operated as Tiberius's personal brothel. Orgies were routine, often involving unwilling participants. Caligula was forced to participate, to prove his loyalty through debasement. Refusing would mean joining his brothers in a dark cell, so he participated, learning to divorce his mind from his body. to function while feeling nothing. Historians later tried to understand what those years on Capri did to Caligula psychologically. The Roman writer Suetonius, writing decades later, noted that Caligula learned to hide all human emotion. He became an actor, wearing a mask of enthusiasm for Tiberius's activities. On the outside, he laughed at the emperor's jokes, applauded the executions, participated in the orgies with apparent enjoyment. On the inside, something fundamental was breaking. Modern psychologists might call it dissociation or survival mode. Medieval scholars would have said his soul was being corrupted. The Romans themselves simply said that Caligula learned to be the perfect slave. He learned that showing weakness meant death. He learned that power came from inspiring fear. He learned that human life had no inherent value, only strategic worth. And most dangerously, he learned that there were no consequences if you had enough power. Tiberius seemed satisfied with his student. He told courtiers that Caligula was proof that you could bend anyone with enough pressure. He bragged that he was raising either the best servant or the worst master Rome would ever see. That quote would later be remembered with horror, because Tiberius was absolutely right, and he chose wrong about which one Caligula would become. The breaking point, the moment when Caligula fully transformed from victim to predator, probably came when his brother Drusus died in 33 AD. Caligula was on Capri when news arrived that Drusus had finally succumbed to starvation in the palace dungeons. His last surviving brother, the final connection to his family, gone. And Caligula couldn't react. He had to stand there, in front of Tiberius and the entire court, and show nothing. No grief, no anger, nothing. That night, alone in his room, something inside him died. Or maybe something worse was born. Because from that moment on, Caligula stopped being a victim waiting to be saved. He started planning. He started thinking about what would happen when Tiberius died. He started imagining what he would do with power, how he would remake Rome into something that reflected what he had learned in this island hell. Tiberius had intended to break Caligula, to create a puppet heir who would continue his policies. What he actually created was a perfect psychopath, someone who understood that morality was a luxury only weak people pretended to value, someone who knew that power was the only truth that mattered, someone who had learned to enjoy cruelty because it was the only emotion that felt real anymore. The years crawled by. Caligula was 23, then 24, then 25. He waited with inhuman patience, playing the role of devoted great-nephew, laughing at Tiberius's jokes, participating in the emperor's degradations, never once showing his true thoughts. He was acting every single moment, and he was brilliant at it. March of 37 AD brought a change. Tiberius, now 77 years old, fell seriously ill. He had been declining for months, his body finally giving out after years of excess and disease. The entire empire held its breath, waiting to see who would inherit power. Tiberius had named Caligula and his own grandson, Gemellus, as joint heirs, but everyone knew that arrangement wouldn't last 5 minutes. On March 16th, Tiberius appeared to die. Court officials began preparing announcements. Caligula started accepting congratulations from courtiers eager to be on the new emperor's good side. The Praetorian Guard began shifting their loyalty. For a few hours, it seemed like the transfer of power would be smooth. Then Tiberius woke up. He opened his eyes, looked around the room, and started trying to speak. The room froze in horror. If Tiberius lived long enough to change his will or give different orders, everything could collapse into civil war. Macro, the Praetorian commander who had been Sejanus's replacement, made a decision. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Tiberius's face. The old emperor struggled, surprisingly strong for a dying man, but he was weak and outnumbered. Caligula watched from across the room as his great-uncle and tormentor was suffocated. Some historians claim Caligula gave the order. Others say he simply didn't stop it. Either way, he stood there and watched Tiberius die, showing nothing on his face. When it was over, when Tiberius was definitely dead, Caligula took the imperial signet ring from the corpse's finger. He was now imperator, supreme commander of Rome, the most powerful person in the world. He was 24 years old. The Senate confirmed him immediately. They had no choice. The Praetorian Guard supported him. The Roman people, remembering his father Germanicus, celebrated in the streets. Finally, they thought, Germanicus's son would bring back the Golden Age. Finally, Rome would have an emperor they could love. They had no idea what Capri had created. They thought they were getting a hero's son. What they got was a monster wearing a hero's face, someone who had spent 6 years learning that cruelty was power, and power was everything. Someone who had been taught by the empire's worst emperor and learned his lessons too well. For 6 months, their hope seemed justified. Caligula would prove to be everything they wanted, and then something would break inside his brain, and Rome would learn what happens when you create a monster and give him absolute power. The first 6 months of Caligula's reign were glorious. He was everything Rome had dreamed of. He declared a general amnesty for political prisoners, released people Tiberius had imprisoned on false charges, and publicly burned the emperor's secret files. He increased the authority of the Senate, giving them real power for the first time in decades. He hosted spectacular games in the Circus Maximus, distributing money to citizens, and generally acted like a generous, benevolent leader. Romans were ecstatic. They had their golden prince back. Germanicus lived again through his son. People genuinely believed they were entering a new age of prosperity and justice. Statues of Caligula appeared throughout the city. Poets wrote verses praising his wisdom and mercy. The Senate voted him unprecedented honors. Caligula seemed to be thriving. He was energetic, charismatic, quick-witted. He gave speeches that moved audiences to tears. He made jokes that had senators laughing genuinely, not from fear, but from actual humor. He visited common people in their neighborhoods, shook hands, kissed babies, and acted like he cared about their problems. It wasn't completely an act. Some part of him probably did enjoy being loved after years of being terrorized. Then October arrived, and everything changed forever. Caligula fell ill. The sickness came suddenly and violently. High fever, severe headaches, convulsions that made his body shake uncontrollably. Imperial physicians had no idea what was wrong. They tried bleeding him, which made it worse. They tried various herbal remedies, which did nothing. For days, Caligula lay in bed, unconscious or delirious, hovering between life and death. Rome panicked. They had just gotten their perfect emperor, and now he was dying. People made offerings at temples, begging the gods to save him. Some citizens publicly vowed to sacrifice their own lives if Caligula recovered. Dramatic gestures meant to show the depth of their devotion. The Senate held emergency sessions, trying to plan for succession while hoping they wouldn't need to. After 2 weeks, the fever broke. Caligula opened his eyes, looked around his bedroom, and appeared to recognize people again. The crisis seemed over. Physicians declared him recovering. Messages went out across the empire. The emperor would live. Rome celebrated with festivals and games. But something had changed. Modern medical historians, looking at the ancient descriptions, believe Caligula suffered from viral encephalitis, a brain infection that causes inflammation and can result in permanent neurological damage. The fever had burned through his brain, destroying tissue, creating lesions, altering the physical structure that controlled personality and impulse control. The Caligula who woke up was not the same person who had fallen ill. Something fundamental had broken inside his mind. The mask he had worn since Capri, the careful performance of normalcy, was gone. What emerged was the raw creature that years of trauma and torture had created, now without any filter or self-control. The first sign came within days of his recovery. Caligula held a public ceremony where he summoned everyone who had vowed to die if he survived. These people had made grand public statements during his illness, swearing they would gladly give their lives to the gods in exchange for the emperor's health. Most of them had assumed it was safe political theater, a way to show loyalty without consequences. Caligula informed them that he had indeed survived, and therefore their vows must be fulfilled. He gave them a choice: commit suicide publicly to honor their word, or be executed for lying to the gods. Several citizens actually went through with it, killing themselves rather than admit they had been making empty gestures. Others tried to argue or beg for mercy. Caligula had them executed anyway, for wasting his time. Rome was stunned. This wasn't justice or piety. This was cruelty for its own sake. But it was just the beginning. Within weeks, Caligula declared himself a living god. Not metaphorically, not in the Eastern style where emperors were deified after death. He claimed to be Jupiter incarnate, literally a god walking among mortals. He ordered a temple built in his honor and demanded that citizens worship him with sacrifices and prayers. He had his face added to statues of Jupiter, replacing the god's head with his own. The sexual behavior became public and outrageous. Caligula began sleeping with his sisters openly, particularly Drusilla, his favorite. Roman society tolerated a lot, but incest was considered deeply taboo. Caligula didn't care. He flaunted the relationships, bringing his sisters to state dinners and treating them as his wives. When anyone objected, he reminded them that Jupiter had married his sister Juno, and therefore as Jupiter on Earth, he was simply following divine precedent. But Drusilla wasn't enough. Caligula started demanding sexual access to the wives of senators and nobles. He would invite couples to dinner, then openly take the wife to his bedroom while the husband sat outside waiting. Refusing was treason. Showing displeasure was treason. Some men actually convinced themselves they were honored to have their wives used by the emperor. The executions became random and frequent. Caligula would order someone killed during dinner because they looked at him wrong, or because their conversation bored him, or because he simply felt like watching someone die. He brought back torture as public entertainment, hosting execution games where victims were killed creatively for the amusement of the crowd. The spending became insane. He built a temporary bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples, over 2 miles long, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor. The project cost enough money to fund the army for a year. After riding across once, he lost interest and had the bridge dismantled. Then came Incitatus, his horse. Caligula loved this horse more than any human. He built Incitatus a marble stable with an ivory stall, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones. The horse had its own house with servants who were required to maintain absolute silence so Incitatus could sleep. Caligula threw dinner parties where Incitatus was the guest of honor, feeding the horse from golden plates. The plan to make Incitatus a consul was real. Caligula announced he would nominate his horse to one of Rome's highest political offices. He said it sarcastically at first, mocking the Senate by suggesting his horse was as qualified as any senator. But then he started meaning it seriously, drawing up the paperwork, preparing the official appointment. Only his assassination prevented it from happening. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, found themselves in an impossible position. They had sworn oaths to defend Caligula, but he was making them participate in atrocities. He would order them to execute their own friends for minor infractions. He mocked them publicly, questioned their masculinity, and generally treated them with contempt. One guard in particular, Cassius Chaerea, became a focal point of resentment. He was an older soldier, a veteran of the Germanic campaigns who had served under Germanicus himself. He remembered the honorable man Caligula's father had been, and now he had to watch the son humiliate him daily. Caligula discovered that Chaerea had a higher-pitched voice than expected for a soldier. He found this hilarious and made it a running joke. Whenever Chaerea came for the daily password, Caligula would give him obscene phrases to repeat, sexual terms and crude jokes, forcing the veteran soldier to stand there and say humiliating things, while other guards tried not to laugh. This went on for months. Chaerea endured it, but his hatred grew. He started talking quietly with other guards, feeling out who else had reached their limit. He found many sympathetic ears. The Praetorian Guard was supposed to be loyal to death, but Caligula had pushed them beyond what any oath could justify. By late 40 AD, multiple conspiracies were forming simultaneously. Senators wanted him dead. Guards wanted him dead. Even some of his own family members wanted him dead. The only question was who would act first and whether they could coordinate well enough to succeed. Caligula seemed oblivious. Or maybe he knew and didn't care. He had absolute power, and in his brain-damaged mind that meant he was untouchable. He was a god. Gods didn't need to fear conspiracies. So he continued his behavior, growing worse each month, creating more enemies, and assuming he would rule forever. January 24th, 41 AD approached. Rome was preparing for the Palatine Games, a festival of theater and athletics. Caligula loved the games and planned to attend. The conspirators saw their opportunity. In the chaos of the festival, with crowds and confusion everywhere, they could strike. All they needed was a moment when Caligula was vulnerable, without his full guard, in a space where they could attack and escape. That moment was coming. And when it arrived, the violence would be so sudden and thorough that it would shock even Rome, a city that thought it had seen every possible atrocity. The monster Tiberius had created, the broken prince who had become a mad god, was about to learn that even emperors could bleed. While Caligula terrorized Rome, there was one family member everyone ignored, his uncle Claudius. He was 50 years old, and nobody took him seriously. He walked with a limp. His head shook uncontrollably, he drooled when nervous, and he stammered so badly that finishing a sentence took visible effort. Most people assumed he was mentally deficient, possibly brain damaged from birth. He was the family embarrassment, kept around out of obligation, but given no real responsibilities. Claudius had been this way his entire life, or so everyone believed. His own mother, Antonia, called him a monster that nature had begun, but never finished. Augustus Caesar had considered him too damaged to hold public office. Tiberius had mocked him openly, and now Caligula kept him around as court entertainment, a living joke to amuse guests. During state dinners, Caligula would make Claudius perform. He would ask him complicated questions, knowing the stammer would make answering nearly impossible. He would have Claudius recite poetry, watching him struggle through verses while guests laughed. Sometimes he would throw food at him, treating his uncle like a performing animal. Claudius would endure it all with apparent good humor, laughing along with the jokes at his expense, playing the fool perfectly. But there was something people missed about Claudius: his eyes. When you looked closely, when you caught him off guard, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, constantly observing. He noticed everything, remembered everything, and said nothing. Because Claudius had figured out the most important survival skill in imperial Rome: be too pathetic to be worth killing. Caligula had executed brilliant senators, powerful generals, wealthy aristocrats, anyone who might pose a threat. But Claudius, he was harmless. Caligula actually enjoyed having him around, the way someone might enjoy a pet that does amusing tricks. Why kill the family idiot when he could provide entertainment? What nobody knew was that Claudius's disabilities were partially exaggerated, a performance he had perfected over 5 decades. Yes, he had a genuine stammer and some physical tremors, probably from cerebral palsy or a similar condition. But he had learned to make himself seem worse than he was, to emphasize the drooling and shaking, to play up his confusion. Every time someone called him stupid to his face, he would nod and agree, confirming their low opinion. In private, Claudius was a scholar. He had written histories of the Etruscans and Carthaginians, serious academic works that showed genuine intelligence and research skill. He could speak multiple languages fluently. He understood politics deeply, having watched 3 emperors rule and fail. But he kept all of this hidden, showing the world only a stammering fool who posed no threat to anyone. Claudius had survived where his brother Germanicus died by poison. He had survived where his nephews died in dungeons. He had survived Caligula's purges that killed dozens of senators and aristocrats. He survived by being beneath notice, by making himself so pathetic that murdering him would be pointless. It was the most successful long-term survival strategy in Roman history, but survival came at a cost. Claudius had to watch his family be destroyed. He had loved his brother Germanicus, had mourned genuinely when poison killed him. He had watched his sister-in-law Agrippina and his nephews be arrested and executed. He had stood by helplessly as Caligula descended into madness. He knew what was happening, understood the atrocities, but couldn't do anything except play his role and wait. January 24th, 40 was. AD started like any normal day for Claudius. He woke in his modest quarters in the imperial palace, ate a simple breakfast, and prepared to attend the Palatine Games with the rest of the court. He had no idea that before the day ended, his entire life would change in the most violent, unexpected way possible. The games were being held in underground passages and courtyards connected to the palace. Caligula was scheduled to watch performances and make public appearances. The festival atmosphere meant crowds of people, guards moving constantly, and general chaos. Perfect conditions for what was about to happen. Cassius Chaerea had finalized his plans. He had recruited several other Praetorian guards and a few senators. They had chosen the underground passage connecting the theater to the palace, a narrow corridor where Caligula would be briefly separated from most of his guards. The plan was simple: attack fast, kill quickly, and either succeed completely or die trying. Around midday, Caligula decided to leave the games and return to the palace for lunch. He was in high spirits, had enjoyed the performances, and was talking animatedly with his German bodyguards. He entered the underground passage, a long corridor lined with marble columns. Most of his guards stayed behind to control the crowd. Only a handful accompanied him through the narrow space. Cassius Chaerea stepped out from behind a column. Other conspirators emerged from hiding spots throughout the passage. For a moment, everyone froze. Caligula looked at Chaerea, started to say something, maybe a joke about passwords or another humiliation. Chaerea stabbed him in the neck. The blow was precise, intended to cut the windpipe and prevent Caligula from calling for help. Blood sprayed across the marble walls. Caligula stumbled, tried to scream, but only gurgling sounds came out. His hands went to his throat, trying to stop the bleeding. Then the other conspirators attacked. They had daggers, short swords, anything they could conceal. They stabbed Caligula repeatedly, in the chest, the stomach, the back, not stopping until he collapsed to the floor. Ancient sources claim he was stabbed at least 30 times, possibly more. The attack lasted less than a minute. Caligula lay on the marble floor of the passage, blood pooling around his body. He was 28 years old. He had ruled for 3 years and 10 months. The young man who had survived Capri, who had learned to be a perfect psychopath, who had declared himself a god, died in a hallway, bleeding out while his killers stood over him making sure he was truly dead. But the conspirators weren't finished. They had planned for this moment, discussed what needed to happen to prevent any chance of Caligula's family seeking revenge or his supporters trying to restore his line. They needed to eliminate everyone connected to him. Guards rushed to Caligula's private quarters, where his wife, Caesonia, was waiting with their infant daughter Julia Drusilla. Caesonia had been Caligula's 4th wife, one of the few people he seemed to genuinely care about. She was in her 30s, not young by Roman standards, but Caligula had been devoted to her. She had given him a daughter, and he had doted on the child obsessively. The guards found Caesonia holding the baby. She realized immediately what was happening, understood that if Caligula was dead, she and her daughter were next. She begged for the child's life, offered to die quietly if they would spare Julia Drusilla. The guards hesitated for a moment, looking at the infant who couldn't have been more than a year old. Then one of them grabbed the baby from Caesonia's arms, raised the child high, and smashed her head against the marble wall. The skull shattered. Brain matter and blood splattered across the expensive frescoes. The guard dropped the tiny body and turned to Caesonia, who was screaming, and stabbed her repeatedly until she stopped moving. The massacre continued throughout the palace. Anyone associated with Caligula closely, anyone who might avenge him or claim succession through him, was hunted down and killed. The marble floors ran red with blood. Servants fled in terror. Some guards participated in the purge. Others tried to protect potential victims, creating chaos and confusion. Claudius had been in the palace when the attack began. He heard screams, heard running footsteps, saw guards with bloody weapons. He understood immediately that a coup was happening, that Caligula must be dead, and that being a member of the imperial family made him a target. His survival instinct kicked in with perfect clarity. He ran, his limp making it difficult, his body shaking, but fear gave him speed he didn't normally possess. He found a balcony with long curtains and dove behind them, pressing himself against the wall, trying to control his breathing, trying to become invisible. Praetorian guards were searching the palace, hunting for family members. One guard noticed the curtains moving slightly, thought he saw feet beneath them. He ripped the curtains aside and found Claudius there, trembling violently, drool running down his chin, eyes wide with terror. The guard grabbed him and dragged him out. Claudius babbled incoherently, his stammer worse than ever from fear, his head shaking uncontrollably. He looked pathetic, terrified, harmless. The guard hesitated. This wasn't a threat. This was the family idiot, the stammering fool everyone mocked. What were they supposed to do with him? Other guards arrived. They conferred quickly. The Senate would need to choose a new emperor, probably would restore the Republic. But in the chaos, they needed someone, anyone, who had a legitimate claim to authority. And technically, Claudius was Germanicus's brother, part of the imperial family, and he was right there. One guard, possibly as a joke, possibly seriously, said they should make Claudius emperor. Others laughed, but then someone pointed out it actually made sense. He was harmless, controllable, and would give them time to figure out what came next. They could always get rid of him later if he caused problems. So they carried Claudius, still trembling and stammering, to the Praetorian camp outside the city. They placed him on a platform, gave him some wine to calm him down, and proclaimed him emperor. Claudius stood there, shaking, barely able to speak, looking completely overwhelmed. The guards swore their oaths of loyalty, probably many of them smirking at the absurdity of swearing to protect this trembling fool. News reached the Senate that the Praetorians had proclaimed Claudius emperor. The senators were furious. They had been debating restoring the Republic, dividing power, ending the imperial system that had brought them Tiberius and Caligula. And now the guards had just appointed another emperor without consulting them? But they had no choice. The Praetorians controlled the military force in Rome. Opposing them meant civil war. Reluctantly, angrily, the Senate confirmed Claudius as emperor. They assumed he would be a puppet, easily controlled, probably dead within a year from either incompetence or assassination. They were completely wrong. Because the fool everyone had underestimated for 50 years was about to reveal that his entire life had been the most elaborate survival act in history. And the revenge of the family that had seemed destroyed was just beginning. Emperor Claudius shocked everyone by being competent. Within months of taking power, he demonstrated intelligence that seemed impossible for the drooling idiot everyone thought they knew. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy, creating efficient departments for finance, correspondence, and legal affairs. He launched a successful military invasion of Britain, something even Julius Caesar had attempted and failed to complete. He reformed Roman courts, personally hearing cases and demonstrating knowledge of law that suggested decades of secret study. The stammer remained, the physical tremors continued, but somehow Claudius was governing effectively. Senators who had dismissed him as a joke found themselves dealing with an emperor who understood politics better than they did. The Praetorian guards who thought they could control him discovered he had his own plans and no intention of being anyone's puppet. The truth slowly became clear. Claudius had been acting for 50 years. Not completely, his physical disabilities were real, but he had exaggerated them deliberately, turned himself into such an object of ridicule that nobody considered him threatening. While everyone mocked him, he had been watching, learning, preparing for a moment he probably never expected would actually arrive. His brother Germanicus had been brilliant and charismatic, and poison had killed him at 33. His nephews had been intelligent and ambitious, and they had died in dungeons. Claudius had survived by being the fool, by making himself seem worthless. It was the most successful long-term political strategy in Roman history, and it had worked perfectly. For 13 years, Claudius ruled Rome. He wasn't a great emperor, but he was stable, rational, and relatively decent compared to what came before. He completed major public works projects, including a new aqueduct and an artificial harbor at Ostia. He granted citizenship to many provincials, expanding what it meant to be Roman. He was harsh with criminals, but fair with citizens. Rome recovered from the chaos of Caligula's reign and returned to something resembling normalcy. But Claudius made one catastrophic mistake. He married his niece. Agrippina the Younger was Germanicus's daughter, Caligula's sister, and Claudius's niece. Marrying her required getting special permission from the Senate, since it was technically incest. But Agrippina was ambitious, intelligent, and beautiful. She convinced Claudius that the marriage would strengthen his political position by connecting him more closely to the popular memory of Germanicus. What Claudius didn't understand was that Agrippina had her own agenda. She had a son from a previous marriage, a teenage boy named Nero, and she was determined to make Nero emperor, no matter what it took. Agrippina worked systematically. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, making him officially part of the imperial family. She pushed Claudius to give Nero honors and public positions, building his profile. She arranged for Nero to marry Claudius's daughter Octavia, creating multiple family connections, and slowly she marginalized Britannicus, Claudius's biological son and actual heir. By 54 AD, Claudius was 63 years old and starting to realize he had been manipulated. He began making statements suggesting he would restore Britannicus as his primary heir, cutting Nero out. Agrippina heard these rumors and understood she was running out of time. If Claudius officially named Britannicus heir, all her plans would collapse. October 13th, 54 AD was a feast day. Claudius attended a banquet where he ate and drank heavily, as was his habit. Among the dishes served were mushrooms, one of his favorite foods. The mushrooms had been prepared by Helotus, his official food taster, someone who should have been completely trustworthy. Within hours, Claudius became violently ill, vomiting, diarrhea, intense abdominal pain. He recognized the symptoms, had seen them before in others who had been poisoned. He tried to call for help, to name his suspicions, but his stammer made communication difficult, and people assumed he was just sick from overeating. The physician called to treat him was Xenophon, Agrippina's personal doctor. Ancient sources claim Xenophon, instead of helping, actually made things worse. He allegedly stuck a feather coated with additional poison down Claudius's throat, supposedly to help him vomit, but actually delivering a second dose to finish the job. Claudius died in agony that night. His last coherent action was reportedly trying to write a message, his hand shaking so badly from both his lifelong tremor and the poison that the words were illegible. The man who had survived by playing a fool for 5 decades, who had outwitted everyone and ruled successfully for 13 years, died the same way his brother had died, poisoned by family. Agrippina immediately moved to secure Nero's succession. She hid news of Claudius's death for hours, while she arranged for the Praetorian Guard to proclaim Nero emperor. By the time the Senate learned Claudius was dead, Nero was already in power, and opposing him would mean civil war. They confirmed him reluctantly, just as they had confirmed Claudius. The autopsy of Claudius, conducted secretly and documented by Agrippina's enemies years later, revealed the truth. His stomach was filled with the remains of poisoned mushrooms. The mushrooms had been coated with a specific toxin, probably extracted from deadly nightshade or similar plants. It had been a professional assassination, carefully planned and perfectly executed. But the grotesque revelation went deeper. When physicians examined Claudius's brain during the autopsy, they found something unexpected. His brain structure was completely normal. There was no physical damage, no deformity, nothing that would explain the tremors and stammer he had displayed his entire life. Modern medical understanding suggests he likely had a mild movement disorder, something like essential tremor or early Parkinson's, but nothing that would have made him the drooling idiot everyone believed him to be. Claudius had been acting almost the entire time. For 50 years he had exaggerated genuine minor disabilities into complete incompetence, had made himself into a joke so elaborate that everyone believed it. He had survived by becoming invisible in plain sight, and then had ruled successfully once given the chance. And in the end, he had been murdered anyway, killed by the same family dynamics that had destroyed his brother and nephews. The dynasty Germanicus had hoped to leave as his legacy was now complete. Germanicus himself, poisoned at 33. His wife Agrippina the elder, beaten and starved to death. 2 of his sons tortured and starved in dungeons. His son Caligula, stabbed 30 times, his infant daughter's head smashed against a wall. His brother Claudius, poisoned by his own niece and wife. 3 generations destroyed by poison, betrayal, and family violence. And the final bitter irony. Agrippina the younger, Germanicus's daughter who had orchestrated Claudius's murder to make her son emperor, would herself be murdered by that same son. In 59 AD, 5 years after Claudius's death, Emperor Nero decided his mother had become inconvenient. He tried to kill her with a collapsing boat, but she swam to shore. So he sent assassins to her villa, and they stabbed her to death. Her last words were reportedly to point at her womb and say, "Strike here, this bore Nero." The curse of Germanicus, if such things exist, had come full circle. The dynasty he had hoped to establish had consumed itself completely through poison, violence, and betrayal. Every major figure was dead, murdered by their own family members in an endless cycle of vengeance and power. The beautiful prince who had been Rome's hope died first, and his death set off a chain reaction that destroyed everyone connected to him. Historians would later marvel at the sheer scale of dysfunction in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. 5 emperors. Augustus died naturally, probably. Tiberius was suffocated. Caligula was stabbed 30 times. Claudius was poisoned. Nero eventually committed suicide after being declared a public enemy. Not one peaceful succession. Not one natural death after Augustus. Just violence, poison, and family destroying family in the pursuit of power. The final grotesque detail came from Claudius's will, discovered after his death. He had been writing a history of his own life, a secret manuscript documenting everything he had seen and done. In it, he detailed the act he had maintained, the strategies he had used to survive, and the satisfaction he had felt at fooling everyone for so long. He wrote about watching his family be destroyed and being unable to help them, about playing the idiot while his heart broke. The manuscript also contained his suspicions about Agrippina. He had figured out her plans months before his death, understood that she was maneuvering to replace him with Nero. He had written about his intention to stop her, to restore Britannicus as his heir. But he had moved too slowly, trusted too much that she wouldn't dare poison him. His last entries were filled with regret, not for his life, but for failing to protect his son from the same fate that had destroyed his brother's children. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, survived only months after his father's death. At a dinner party in February 55 AD, he drank wine and collapsed. Nero claimed it was an epileptic seizure. Everyone knew it was poison. He was 14 years old, the last direct descendant of Claudius, eliminated because he threatened Nero's power. The cycle continued. The dynasty that had begun with the poisoning of Germanicus ended with the poisoning of Britannicus, with 3 generations destroyed in between. Every death led to another death. Every murder sparked revenge that required more murders. Power corrupted absolutely, and absolute power turned family into a death sentence. The darkest side of the empire wasn't the orgies or the public executions or the mad declarations of divinity. It was the simple fact that being born into imperial family meant you would probably die violently, killed by someone who shared your blood. Rome would remember the Julio-Claudian emperors with horror and fascination for the next 2,000 years. They became legends of depravity, cautionary tales about unchecked power. But the real lesson was simpler and darker. When you teach people that survival means becoming monsters, don't be surprised when they become very good at it. And when you build a system where family members murder each other for power, don't expect anyone to survive with their humanity intact. Germanicus had been the perfect prince. His death created monsters. And those monsters destroyed everything his bloodline had built, until there was nothing left but ashes and the memory of what might have been if Rome's best man hadn't been poisoned at 33.